You're on, Gary.
Welcome everyone to the second session of this year's first half of our annual conference. And we have a bunch of speakers today.
Gary, you're coming in and out.
Yeah.
We don't spend a lot of people.
You will need to restart again, Gary, because we barely could hear you.
Are going long time.
Gary, it's not working.
No.
So we may have to go to our co-host until the system can be fixed.
All right.
Hello?
Yes.
Okay. Carmelo, distinguished service professor
Gary?
No, not working.
of economics in Latin University of Pittsburgh.
It's not working, Gary. We're gonna, I think we're gonna go to Louis for.
Yeah, Louis would be better.
Try to dial, Gary, try to dial in. There is a phone number in the email. Try to dial in and connect with your cell phone in the meantime. Just mute this one and try to access with the cell phone. And maybe we could have a better audio from you.
Yeah. In the meantime, Luis.
All right. Maybe I will go ahead and introduce our panelists. And Carmelo Mesa-Lago will be our first speaker. He is distinguished professor emeritus from the University of Pittsburgh, has a very long and distinguished career as an analyst of labor markets in Latin America and many other distinctions. Has published a large number of articles and books. And without more about our distinguished panelist, I will mention something about Vadim Grishin, who is also has a long career, distinguished career as well. Was in the Russian Federation government as advisor to the Deputy Prime Minister, I believe, and was the executive board of the World Bank, and has been lecturing in economics, in international relations at George Washington and Georgetown Universities in Washington. And I am an economist, international economist in Massachusetts. Have been involved with international organizations and international financial companies for many years. Without further ado, I think we should pass the word to Carmelo, who will begin his presentation.
Hello to everybody. It's a pleasure to be here. And my presentation is going to discuss adverse external sector impacts on the Cuban economy. So here is a summary. The Cuban economy is enduring the worst economic crisis since the 1990s after the collapse of the Soviet Union and the socialist camp. What I am going to do is first summarize a series of key economic indicators that will give you an idea of the magnitude of the current crisis. And I will be basing this on A, which is the national Cuban National Office of Statistics and Information, and CEPAL or ECLAC. At the core of the presentation is going to analyze the impact of three external causes in the Cuban crisis. I call it the triple crisis because of this. The first is a cut in economic aid from and trade with Venezuela. The second one is Trump's sanctions that have tightened the US embargo. And the third one is the pandemic and the world economic crisis caused by it. If I have time, then I will offer some key policies to cope with the crisis. So here is the first economic indicator. As you can see, when Raul took over on 2006, GDP, gross domestic product, grew 12%. Now, if you look at the last 4 years, from 16 to 19, essentially what you have here is stagnation. But in 2020, according to CEPAL or ECLAC, the Cuban economy will contract by 8%. The Economist Intelligence Agency system also predicts a decline of 8.3%. If you average the last 5 years, 2016 to 2020, the annual decline is minus 0.6%. Now you have to compare this with the official target annually of GDP growth, which is from 6 to 7%. So Cuba not only is in a crisis, but they have done abysmally in terms of the target. Now I have a series of indicators here, and the first one is gross capital formation. It averaged 9.7% in 2014, 2018. You have to compare this with 25% in the year 1989, right before the crisis, but also 25% is the target that officially set by the Cuban government in terms of gross capital formation. So the performance of Cuba is considerably, again, below the target. And also it's about 1/2 of the Latin American and Caribbean average given by CEPAL, which was 19% in the same period. The fiscal deficit grew from 1.3 to 8% in 2013, 2018. It was higher in 2019 and certainly will in 2020. Monetary liquidity, which is M2, rose from 34 to 59% of GDP in the same period, and is growing. Something important is that this 59% is the highest figure since 1993, which was the worst year of the crisis of the 1990s. And the index of industrial production shows, all of these are official figures, by the way, shows a decline of 33 percentage points from 1989 to 2018. I have put together a series of output levels, both in industrial, in agricultural cattle, and in mining manufacturing. And I use a period from 2007 to 2018. And what the data show is that in 2018, it was below the peak reached in this 24 products, which are the most important in both areas. And furthermore, in the case of agriculture, 7 of them in 2018 were below the 1989 level, and 5 of them in the case of mining and manufacturing were below the 1989 level. So due to this poor economic domestic performance, Cuba has a systematic deficit in the trade balance of goods. I'm not talking about service, goods, merchandise. For instance, in 2018, exports of goods were half of the 1989 level, whereas imports were above by 41%. And therefore, the balance of goods deficit grew 220%. Finally, in 2019, Cuba failed to pay $33 million of its debt with the Paris Club. The club had given Cuba an ultimatum to pay capital due in the rest of the capital due in 2019 and 2020 by June 2021. Now, I am going to show you the impact of the crisis in the three major sources of Cuba hard currency. And the first one is our exports of professional services, mostly health personnel. This is in current prices and it's in million US dollars. As you can see, there was a peak in 2013 of $10 billion. That was very important because it actually compensated for the deficit of goods and generated a surplus. But as you can see, that declines gradually, and then in 2018, goes down to $6.7 billion, and that is a decrease of 35%. I am going to show you also how this compares with Cuban GDP. So the exports of professional services peak, as you can see, in 2019. It was $3.7 billion, but they were all, excuse me, 1 second, please. Yeah, okay. I'm sorry. Let me start all over again. This is the second source of hard currency, which are foreign remittances in million US dollars. And as you can see, there was a peak in 2019, 3.7 billion, but it was very similar to 2018. It was basically stagnant, but then there is a big drop in 2020. That's a projection done by Emilio Morales. And the decline here is also 35%. So what caused this? This was caused essentially by a combination of Trump measures and the pandemic. And the third source of hard currency in Cuba is international tourism. I present this in gross revenue, which is the blue bar, and in net revenue, which is the red bar. It's much less because it's gross revenue, you subtract imports for the tourist industry, and that gives you the real revenue that the Cuban government gets. The orange curve is the number of tourists in thousands. All right, so you can see that there is, again, a peak in tourists in 2018, but it's very similar to 2017. This began the effect of the Trump measures and also the COVID-19. And it declines very sharply in 2020. These are my projections. It declined to 1.8 million tourists. That decline is equivalent to 62%. It's a very sharp decline. And then if you look at the gross revenue, of course, net revenue is much lower, it's a red one. The peak is reached in 2017, and it declines to it declines from $3.2 million to $1.1 billion. So that's a decline of $2 billion or 65%. If we use net revenue, of course, it will be worse. What caused this? Two external factors, the Trump measures and the pandemic. Okay, now, so we go into the first external factor that causes a adverse effect in the Cuban economy, and this is Venezuela, the crisis in Venezuela. The blue curve is all the total economic relationship between the two countries. As you can see, it peaked in 2012 at $16 billion, and it went down to $1.5 billion in 2017. And then you have the different components of this total relationship in blue. The first one in red is the professional service. We saw before total professional service. Venezuela buys about 75% of the total. So there was a peak of 7.8 billion in 2013. That decreases to 5.8 billion in 2017. And that is a decline of 24%. The green is the supply of oil, also $1 million. And as you can see, the peak is in 2012, it's like 6 billion. And in 2017, it's 1.8 billion. That's a decline of 70%. We are going to say something about this later on. And the last one, the purple, is all trades other than oil, trade of goods other than oil. We have now here showing the value of the economic relationship, the total economic relationship with all the components in relation to Cuba GDP. As you can see, it increases steadily and reaches 22% of GDP in 2012, and then declines to 8% of Cuban GDP in 2017. That's a decline of 14 percentage points. So that's a very big blow to Cuba, and you saw that in hard currency before. Trump's sanctions. The first one, I have ordered them by their adverse effect on the Cuban economy. So the Title C of the Helms-Burton Act, which is the Embargo Act, you have $8 billion in certified claim plus I don't know how much billions in non-certified claim. What is the major effect of this? A virtual freeze of new direct foreign investment concerning the investment that was already in Cuba. Some of them stayed, some of them left. Something important also is that there were several investments in process that were canceled. The second major damage is in terms of US tourists. They shrank by 22% in 2019. This is totally the Trump measures. And then 72% in January, March of 2020. That's a combination of Trump and the COVID virus. And why was that? Because Trump banned on cruises, flights to provinces in Cuba other than Havana, and US American tourists banned to lodge in hotels and eat in restaurants run by the military. The cost of this, $1.1 billion. The other one is the strengthening sanctions on international banks that do business with Cuba. The total number of fines imposed by the Trump administration is 12 billion, and that have made very difficult, even more than before, to access foreign credit from Cuba. And then we get the reduction in shipments of Venezuelan oil to Cuba. You saw that in the figure in which I showed the relationship with Venezuela.
Carmelo, you have 5 minutes left.
This reduction in shipments have created fuel shortages in Cuba, have cut output in factories, hotel construction, and a very severe scarcity of liquid gas. But it seems that Maduro have been able to overcome Trump sanctions. Why? Because we have a report which has been confirmed. This discussed this a lot with Jorge Piñón, which is the top expert in the world on this. And Maduro sent Cuba this year, in the first half of 2020.
Carmelo, you have 5 minutes left.
What is happening?
You've got 5 minutes.
40 million barrels in 2020. And then you have the cap on US remittances. The major problem here is that the French bank Credit Mutual have halted all transactions with military managed Finsimex, which is the Cuban agency that handle remittances. And that's, if this is lost, it's $3 billion. Okay, and then finally, we have COVID-19 and the world economic crisis. First, the general impact. All foreign investments stops. There is a further decline in imports that affect agricultural production and food supply, transportation, and manufacturing. There is also a fall in exports in 2020 due both to a sharp decrease in production, but also prices of nickel, sugar, cigars, and medicine. The economic situation in Cuba makes it very difficult to launch an economic package because Cuba is not a member of the IMF, the Inter-American Development Bank, or the World Bank, and therefore it cannot receive any aid that receive all the countries in the region. And finally, Cuba have exported doctors to 14 countries, but these exports won't compensate the cut of $90,000 that took place in Venezuela because of the crisis there. And then in 3 countries that government moved from left to right, Brazil, Ecuador, Bolivia, and also El Salvador. And the impact of tourism, I already give it to you because of the closing of airports and ports in April, July 2020. No tourism in Cuba, 1.3 billion lost in gross revenue. And the impact on remittances because of the shutdown in flights to Cuba that impeded mulas, which are those that carry both cash and goods for 4 months, and that's $1.3 billion. And finally, the US economic crisis affected those sending remittances, particularly Cuban Americans, because there is a very high unemployment in the United States. There are about 30 million people receiving unemployment benefits. A decline in GDP, which is projected annually to 33%, is the worst since the Great Depression. And all this have affected Cuban Americans sending money. So I will finish with the first half of this. And is that the government lacks a comprehensive, innovative strategy to confront the crisis. By the way, Gary, this began at 2:35, okay? So it lacks a comprehensive, innovative strategy to confront the crisis. This is confirmed by all Cuban economists. There is a phenomenal consensus on this. The crisis, the strategy of 2019, it was completely incongruous with the magnitude of the crisis. But last July, a new strategy was announced by the Cuban government. The president, the Minister of Economics, Ministry of Finance, and the president of the Central Bank of Cuba. In my opinion, and also the opinion of the Cuban economists, this appears to be a resumption of moderate reforms toward the market. But here comes the problem. I have identified 31 measures, which I analyzed in a paper, which is about 80 pages long that I just finished. And only 2 of these 31 measures have been implemented, which are selling in dollars durable consumer goods in state shops, and the elimination of the fee of 10% on the Cuban on the dollar exchange. The 94% remaining measures are extremely vague. There are no concrete guides for implementation, and we don't know when this is going to happen. So we have to wait and see whether these measures are implemented to really confirm there is a resumption to the market or not. A transition to a full market economy, like in Eastern European countries, Central and Eastern European countries, would be ideal economically, but politically unlikely. Most Cuban academic economists support a mixed economy. In my opinion, more politically feasible would be the Sino-Vietnamese market socialist path, starting with agriculture, which is a major Cuban problem. If Cuba follows the same path as China and Vietnam, which is allow farmers, all kinds of farmers, to grow whatever they want, to sell to whoever they want, and to set the price by supply and demand, not by the Acopio price, which is below the market price. I said this incentive, as in Vietnam and China, Cuba will be able to be self-sufficient in agriculture. But the problem that we have is that past and current leaders have rejected this model. Well, so with this, I finish. I don't have time to go into a concrete policy for the future. Thank you very much. Now we have like 20 minutes.
Thank you, Carmelo. Can everybody hear me now?
Yes.
Hopefully.
Yes.
Great. Okay, so I guess our next speaker is Louise. And Louise is a founder and is an independent researcher, started his own research organization in Boston many years ago, specializing in the emerging markets, and has presented many times at ASCE with excellent papers. And with that introduction, I'm going to let Louise take over.
Right, thank you, Gary. I need to share. Let me see. So
Carmelo has to stop
yeah,
sharing.
I think we need to Carmelo. We need to.
I am going to do now.
Okay. Thank you.
Sorry about that.
I'd like to remind all our guests that we have a question and answer box, and we like your questions.
All right, so I'm going to dwell into the first topic that Carmelo mentioned, which is the Venezuela-Cuban relationship, and try to understand what's going on in terms of the flows of both trade and the financial flows. In the case of Venezuela and Cuba, we see only part of what's going on. We see, to some extent, the trade flows, but we don't really see the financial flows very well. And you need to look at both in order to fully understand what is the real transfer of resources between the two economies. So now I'm not going to dwell too much on the history. The Cuba-Venezuela relationship has many dimensions. It's foremost a political and security alliance, so that economics is a second fiddle, is secondary, but oil is critical to Cuba. In economic terms, it allows basic production in Cuba to go on, transportation, electricity, utilities, and so forth. So it is important. The economics for Venezuela are more nebulous because it depends on the services that Cuba is providing to Venezuela. And there are medical services, but there are many other services, security, advice to the government, and other areas, even in computer services and so forth. Now, what we have is a mutual aid agreement to foster economic and political goals between the two countries. And this relationship has evolved over 2 decades into a barter arrangement, essentially between oil and professional services. The thing is that there is a hidden compensation mechanism. Why is that? Well, we will see that Cuba has been running for the last 10 years a big surplus with Venezuela. Cuba has a trade surplus. And the question is, how is this trade surplus settled? And that's the financial part one has to understand. In other words, it's not only that Cuba has, and the figures Carmelo has are in the ballpark, mine are a little bit higher. In trade, I revised mine backwards because the Cubans came up with a new classification in 2018, but they're essentially in the ballpark of the ones that Carmelo just presented. But what I'm trying to do is understand this hidden compensation mechanism that is not public. Now, the paper then looks at the importance of the relationship between to each country and tries to gauge the implied subsidies involved in this relationship. And again, the objective is to shed light into the resource transfers between the two economies, given financial constraints. Now, it's no secret, the oil shipped to Cuba from Venezuela has been going down, and it's been going down in proportion pretty much to Venezuelan oil output. So the shipments have gone up to something like 35% of what they were in 2012. Now, these shipments are gross shipments, which means it includes oil that is also re-exported from Cuba to Venezuela. It happens that Venezuela has facilities in Cuba, PDVSA. No longer they belong to PDVSA, but they were used to store oil and to blend it and refine some of it. And some of that was shipped back to Venezuela. So that particularly this was important in the early years, 2012 to 2015, so that this figure is the gross volume, not the net volume. Later on, I used the net volume, which is strips out re-exports of Venezuelan oil back to Venezuela. And that's still going on, although at a very low rate. And why is that? Well, one reason is that there are storage tanks in Cuba, in Matanzas and Cienfuegos, that are used by Venezuela to store oil. And we actually can tell what the shipments back to Venezuela are from IMF data that it strips that out. Now, I'm going to look now at Venezuela. How does this trade look from the Venezuela side? Well, we know that the Venezuelan economy is in pretty bad shape. GDP per capita is less than half what it was in 2012. Oil production is 1/3 what it was in 2012. And they've had hyperinflation, which peaked in 2018 at about 130,000%, still very high in 2019, although stabilized when it's gone down a little bit. This means, by the way, we can't really measure things in Venezuela very well because of price instability. Now, what about the exports to Cuba? Well, we saw they shrank to about 1/3, a little bit less than 1/3. They're a small part of Venezuela's GDP, and about 7% of oil exports in 2017, 10% in 2018, and about a little bit less of its oil production. What is interesting is that the Cuba shipments are a significant part of its own import bill, which is about, I cannot see my 2019 number, but 2018 is about close to 1/4 of its own import bill. So the opportunity cost of Venezuela to ship oil to Cuba is significant. In other words, it's a very important cost to the Venezuelan economy of shipping this oil, particularly now that it has other very severe economic problems. Now let's look at the Cuban side. So the Cuban side, we have, these are the services exports. These numbers are a little bit higher than Carmelo, as I explained. I worked them out backwards, given a new structure of services that Cuba published in 2018. And there are about 6 billion. And essentially, this is what you can tell from the Cuban data. That is what is recorded in the Cuban data. Now, here you see the breakdown, merchandise exports, goods exports were much smaller, and they dwindled significantly. The bulk of it was oil. This was oil reshipped to Venezuela, as I mentioned, was 1.9 billion in 2013. So it's quite a significant amount that was shipped back. As a part of the Cuban economy, it is important. 9% of GDP, it's around 7% in 2017. And most importantly, they are the bulk of the services exports of Cuba, including tourism. They were close to 60% of all Cuba services exports go to Venezuela, if you take the official numbers. And again, they're also the opportunity cost, they're quite important in terms of funding imports. Oh, I am missing. Okay, sorry, something happened here. Now let's look at the balance of trade. So this is the trade surplus. This is the bilateral trade surplus that Cuba has with Venezuela. So Cuba has been running a trade surplus with Venezuela, quite significant, about 4.9 billion in 2018. And we cannot tell 19, I don't have a figure, but I think it's probably around a little bit less than around the 2018 figure. So that's what Venezuela has to settle with Cuba. So what I do is I try to figure out how much of a subsidy there is in all these transactions. Here I calculate what I call the grant. You can tell from just bartering, exchanging oil for services. And what I do is I measure Cuban services at what the market price for these services would be. I use the Brazilian salary that was paid to Cuban doctors, which we can tell. The Brazilian government has official numbers for this. So this is, and I assume that that's a good going rate for a Cuban doctor in Latin America. although there are a lot of problems with doing this, which I acknowledge. Among other things, it's influenced by the Brazilian exchange rate, which actually has been depreciating. So the Cubans are taking a cut in Brazil. But they're still there, or were still there until the program ended in 2018. So looking at this, oil grant, assuming there is nothing else, in other words, Venezuela does not give any money to Cuba, then we come up to the fact that there's very little subsidy when you measure it at market prices. Now, in this line, we are measuring the subsidy if it's according to what the figures say. In other words, what UNAID publishes, the figure is very, very high, $5 billion per year. That's, of course, a lot of money, and still around that in the last 2 years. So the question is, how is this paid? How is Venezuela settling this full grant? In other words, the way to look at this is the minimum subsidy, which can be almost nothing at some point. This is the maximum subsidy. It's what Cuba gets out of Venezuela if Venezuela had the financial ability to settle this. Now, in order to have the financial ability, it has to and pay in hard currency, has to get the hard currency. Now, the agreement, which one can get a copy of it, between Fidel Castro and Hugo Chavez, mentioned that this arrangement would be settled in either oil, hard currency, or bolivars. Of course, bolivars are worth nothing. And we know that some of the services are paid in bolivars anyway. So the question is, how much of this difference is actually the real subsidy? And that depends on Venezuela's ability to pay. Now, another way to look at it is that these are the exports of professional services. This is how much Venezuela pays in oil, which it does pay. So it pays some of it in oil, and this is the part that has to be financed. Now, can Venezuela finance this? And the answer is, right now, no. And last year, no. It is in dire financial shape. So what this means is that these exports, in effective terms, have been really going down for a number of years, depending on Venezuela's ability to settle this subsidy, this so-called subsidy. Now, actually, when I calculated all of this, and this is interesting, I compare Venezuela, I calculated by looking at the exports of medical services to all the other countries that Cuba exports. There's a list published by the Ministerio de Salud Pública.
Luis, you have 5 minutes left.
5 minutes, okay. So Venezuela, it's in the neighborhood of 6 billion. And Brazil, which is the second market, was the second market until 2018 when it was close. It was only in 2000, on average for this period, about $370 million. So it's a very, very small fraction. The third markets are Algeria and Angola, and then Algeria. And this goes down, about $90 million for Angola on average, Algeria around 60-some million per year. These are numbers published officially by the governments of Angola and Algeria, so they're not invented. And then these are the Gulf countries, 3 countries in the Persian Gulf that Cuba exports to, average around close to 100 million. These are the other 10. So essentially, Venezuela is close to 90% of the market. So what this really means is that this is critical in terms of the question of medical services, and the dependence on Venezuela is very high. Now, you look at Venezuela's ability to pay, these are financial assets, and these are hard numbers measured by the Bank for International Settlement. So Venezuela's financial assets have converged from 13 billion to a little bit over what Cuba's financial assets are measured by the same, by the bank. These are hard numbers, so they can be seen. So essentially, they're almost the same as Cuba. Another way to look at it these are Venezuela and Cuba non-oil imports. Food and medicines are very important to both countries, which are heavily dependent. And Venezuela's import bill have gone down to the level of Cuba. In 19 and 2000, we have the first quarter here, which means, well, Venezuela has almost 3 times the population of Cuba, a little bit less than 3 times. And it has the same level of essential imports as Cuba does. So Venezuela is in no position to essentially settle this debt that it incurs, presumably, with Cuba. Now, just to finish, I'm running out of time. This business of medical services, well, there are many questions. There are moral questions about it, the way it takes place. But on the financial side, what happens is that Cuba's clients, there are 68 countries listed by the Anuario Estadístico de Salud. And these 68 countries are really not very creditworthy. Only 11 are investment grade, and 5 are a little bit below. And all of these are either well below, or not, when they're not rated, it means they're not rated for a good reason. So about 3/4, a little bit over 3/4 of these countries are not really very creditworthy. So what's happening? Well, this flow of income from medical services, it probably is not taking place in dollars. And it poses questions. I think I'm not talking about this in the paper, but it may be if Cuba had a much better system, which is essentially, if it wants to provide medical assistance, that's a nice thing. But if it wants to make doctors happy and have remittances increase, it should liberalize the contracting of services individually by doctors, and they can send remittances back to Cuba. And if there is a good fiscal system, they can be taxed, as opposed to having the system, which now doesn't really, from the economic viewpoint, it is important. I mean, some countries. Sorry?
Time's over.
All right. So, yeah, okay. So the conclusions, I already spoke clearly about it, so I'm done.
I think you spoke very clearly. All right.
All right.
Next up is Vadim Grishin. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. Vadim is an adjunct professor at George Washington University. For many years, he was a board member of the World Bank Group and a senior advisor to the IMF. His PhD is in the social sciences. And if I remember correctly, he's also got a background in Russia, but we'll let that pass for the moment. So Vadim, it's yours.
Thank you very much, Gary. Hello, everybody. Thank you for the honor of the invitation. Distinguished speakers of our panel have already described channels through which present asymmetric dependency between Cuba and Venezuela has added uncertainties and vulnerabilities to both nations in these times of current global upheaval. We can likely better understand the consequences of ongoing events that belong to the category of a perfect storm if we once again look at the nature of the Venezuelan political, socio-economical, and humanitarian tragedy aggravated by the COVID-19 pandemic and the global economic recession. It's an unprecedented drama of continental scale, clearly linked to the core of Venezuela's system, a resource-dependent state. I will do several bullet points in my presentation here, which likely will not be fully complete, but hopefully will enable to have a wider discussion. My first bullet point is the following. Whatever methodology we apply, whether using a structural approach, a resource curse concept, or an institutional equilibrium method, among others, all of them identify Venezuela as a topical petrostate, heavily dependent on commodity exports, on an exporting sector rather than revenue from taxation, with mismanaged and corrupt institutions and a non-diversified and de-industrialized economy. The current political regime has dramatically worsened all the weak spots of its resource curse. Suffice it to say that Venezuela's average GDP growth during the last 10 years was about -9%. Further, I will be using a comparative data analysis in my slides with average regional indicators, as well as indicators from two referent oil producing countries, Colombia and Mexico. While understanding significant differences between the three of them, it's also evident that Venezuelan statistics are not very reliable. There is a huge informal sector in the country, a black market that includes proceeds from narco trafficking, illegal gold mining, and in-kind trade of oil goods. Such illicit activities are not tracked by data, but accessible information does show us some important trends. The first evident conclusion from the table of GDP growth is that Venezuela has lost half a century of development. And during the last 40 years, it has experienced a negative growth of -2%. My second point here is that the country has literally dropped into downfall economic vortex, into negative territory every 4 years. We can see here very clearly. Since 2012, it has dropped into free fall. Such a plunge during a peacetime crisis started long before serious US sanctions were imposed, during a period when oil prices were still relatively high. Let me show you this slide. And national crude oil production was relatively stable. Such extremely high economic volatility decoupled Venezuela's GDP growth from oil price cycle and revealed an accumulation of institutional and structural issues, so that rising oil prices didn't translate into rising crude production. Therefore, rather popular thesis that Venezuela's economic crisis is an imported product, la crisis económica es un producto importado, is not relevant. Here we can see a plateau of production from 2003 to 2015 that was generally created by joint ventures involving American, Chinese, and Russian oil companies, international private IOCs, and most state-owned NOCs. They generated so-called windows of efficiency, and we will talk about them a little bit later. In my third point here, I'd like to mention that over the past decade, Venezuela has experienced a significant loss of accumulated national wealth, and GDP per capita has declined by more than half. In that regard, one can hear arguments that the country has nowhere further to fall, and its predicament will eventually become a launching pad for a new revival in the country after it goes through regime change. However, the experience of deep structural transformations, including post-communist transit in Europe and Eurasia, show that a transitional recession will almost be inevitable, even if it proves to be short. This prospect will apply to the future Cuban transition as well. Venezuela has long been an oil country, and many efforts have been made to diversify its economy. In general, its export diversification index has been in line with regional trends. But starting in the early 2000s, we see a widening gap emerge with peer countries in the region. Looking at this trend overall, it's understandable why all attempts at diversification in the past 20 years have failed. Venezuela falls into a category of different petrostate traps. When oil prices are high, it's easier to import goods and services, especially when an environment for private initiative is unfavorable, as happened at the time when the country ruined its own agriculture. When oil prices begin to plunge, it's also necessary to urgently patch holes in the budget and correct fiscal imbalances. Furthermore, in a petrostate, there are always protected budget items that can't be touched, such as military spending, payments to bureaucracy, and some social subsidies in order for the state to maintain its political and social base. Nevertheless, there is a more mysterious and difficult phenomenon to explain, which is why the regime was unable to invest in the oil sector. Frankly speaking, I was initially taken aback when I saw PDVSA's strategic plan outlined in its 2008 financial report, projecting an increase in crude production to 5 mbpd by 2013 and 6.5 mbpd by 2021. I believe the reality was quite different. The World Bank has defined such forecast errors with a huge divergence of performance from expectations as a growth disappointment effect. Despite numerous development opportunities, particularly in the Orinoco Belt, a negative growth multiplier emerged that could have been named the Chavez coefficient or the Maduro moment. Ultimately, Venezuela's regime, intentionally or unintentionally, ended up underinvesting in that oil sector. Consequently, and not surprisingly, crude production experienced an accelerated decline starting from 2015, and the regime successfully sawed off the branch on which it was sitting. Putting it another way, it killed the hand that laid the golden egg. Another question that comes to mind is what Venezuela's driving force of economic growth were. For almost 20 years, 12 years, from 2004 to 2016, when oil production in the country stagnated and remained at a level of 2.5 barrels per day. The answer is obvious. Growth happened because of activities in the private sector. Private sector GDP, when Chavez came to power, was about 65%. But starting in 2012, a rapid decline began and currently shares to less than 45%. Such a development was not a coincidence. State dirigism was practiced for over 20 years. Among other things, it nationalized businesses, determined the exchange rates, and set the prices of basic goods. According to the World Bank study, in this slide, it's almost impossible to start a business legally in the country. Venezuela's rank in ease for starting a business is 190 out of 190 countries in the world, and its overall rating as a place to do business is third from the bottom after Somalia and Eritrea. The extremely deplorable state of country's economic and political institutions have suffocated under the regime of Maduro, who has completed the destruction of democratic liberties initiated by Chavez, explain Venezuela's very low score in the Index of Economic Freedom, which estimates rule of law, regulatory efficiency, government size, and open markets. In fact, there have been limited inflows of private money in the country in the 2000s and substantial outflows during that time. Despite tightening currency controls, the average balance of capital movements in the 2010s has remained negative. Net outflows were in range of 5 to 35 billion euros annually, which have accelerated the country's drive towards a full-fledged economic collapse. In 2019, Maduro put forward a new economic program, which some loyalists call the Tropical China, a kind of business liberalization with relaxed state interference and declining regulations for fighting shortages of goods. This unexpected shift, supported by Venezuela's business and political elite, has brought a sense of relief, especially to those who have relied on dollar remittances from abroad. On the one hand, it's a replica of Cuba's approach to flow of remittances. On the other hand, the roots of this recent policy by Maduro can be found in Bolsheviks' economic practice, so-called NEP, introduced by Lenin after the bloody Russian Civil War in August 1921, almost 100 years ago, the net was masterfully designed to bring capital into the state and to help the state prosper economically. Nevertheless, it was a short-lived policy rejected by Stalin 3 years later in 1924. Maneuvers of a similar kind under the current regime in Venezuela are timid and not sustainable. They have been accompanied by political repressions and the destruction of the country's remaining democratic institutions. The COVID pandemic has also limited implementation of recent economic policies there. It would seem evident that any substantial economic progress would be possible only with deep political transformations. The current system is exhausted and can't generate economic growth or reach a political settlement. In this section, I'd like to mention something about hyperinflation. Generally, it's economically disastrous and extremely painful to a broad population group. Unfortunately, that reality became endemic in modern Venezuela. By the time the IMF reported that the country had reached an inflation rate of 1,000,000% in 2018, even though it lasted a short period of time. At that point, we seemed to be dealing not only with an irresponsible management of monetary populism, but also with a deliberate policy based on gross conceptual error, presuming that inflation was predominantly driven by non-monetary factors. There was also a view that the Venezuelan state allowed a decline in oil production to reduce the availability of foreign currency and to foster a depreciation of the exchange rate that ultimately incentivize high inflation. These measures may have potentially triggered that inflation, but they were not the main cause. In any case, there is a well-known golden rule indicating that it's easy to spread high inflation by letting the genie out of the bottle, but it's very complicated to get out of an inflationary spiral. Finally, several comments about sanctions and corporate policies. Due to time constraint, I will limit myself only to sectorial sanctions, in particular the US oil embargo. Overall sanctions are a mix of geopolitics, business interest, and broader non-commercial interests. In the case of Venezuela, there were serious concerns and reluctance on the part of the American oil refining sector to implement a strict oil embargo. Venezuela's crude oil exports through the years were pretty significant by volume, despite the steady decline that started in 2005. Heavy grades of Venezuelan oil were also technologically attached to the updated and costly technologies of US refineries. Venezuela's oil was also cheap, sold to the US at significant discount. We also know that until recently, Chevron managed to get a waiver for its joint venture production in Venezuela after sanctions were imposed, which kept the country crude production afloat. The reasons for this inconsistency are understandable. Chevron not only fought to maintain its profits and privileged commercial goals, but also hedged against the potential risk of having Chinese and Russian oil companies seize its production facilities. Thus, they were commercial corporate interests entangled with US geopolitical interests. Such situations are usual for IOCs owned by private capital. The commercial component of IOCs' activities is normally visible and palpable. NOCs, national oil companies, owned by state, are different and tend to be much more sensitive to non-commercial goals, and they are obedient to decisions made by the political leadership in countries as China and Russia. Nevertheless, in the case of Venezuela, we can see different patterns of behavior on the part of Chinese and Russian NOCs. Chinese companies are more cautious and try to avoid directly challenging US sanctions. They demonstrate their desire to preserve access to Venezuela's oil market and want to be repaid for their outstanding loan of about $20 billion. China representatives have also held informal contacts with the country's opposition and personally with Guaido. Here, it's important to note that all political forces in Venezuela, both the government and the opposition, see China not only as a current lender or joint venture partner, but also a potential future strategic investor for rebuilding the country's oil industry. The role that Russia's NOC Rosneft plays in Venezuela is remarkably different. Rosneft is not just an instrument in the hands of the Russian political leadership. It became a key actor that sometimes even determined Russia's foreign policy decisions because of the very special position of the company's CEO, Mr. Sechin, who also happened to be a part of the Russian political hierarchy. Venezuela is a personal pet project of Mr. Sechin, whose power extends far beyond any institutional role he derives. His status is reinforced by his close association with Mr. Putin. He has been an influential member of Putin's inner circle over 30 years. He has also been an informal leader of the enforcement agency's faction in Moscow. However,
3 minutes left.
Yeah, I'm close to summarizing. Rosneft's policy remains dependent on the will and whim of Russian president. To avoid the extreme predicament of becoming cannibalized by Russian geopolitics, Rosneft frequently uses its lobbying power to obtain significant fiscal benefits, enjoys state protection from bankruptcy, gets opportunities to acquire other rivals' companies, and writes off losses at the expense of the state, as recently happened in Venezuela. When the United States this year sanctioned the company's subsidiaries, Rosneft Trading and Tenka Trading, for working with PDVSA, Rosneft sold all its joint ventures, service companies, and trading operations in Venezuela to another Russian state-owned entity. In return, it received $3.8 billion. And final slide is this one. Rosneft has also profited from a reduction in Venezuela production and from the imposition of a US oil embargo by acting together with Canadian companies as a replacement for Venezuela's heavy crude exports to the US. The US market is not very big for them, but it's important because the company received cash payment there. And finally, short summary. My presentation has focused mainly on the overwhelming structural crisis in Venezuela, where a petrostate has crashed and an authoritarian regime has flirted with ideas of tropical socialism. The country's fundamental problems come from the oil-dependent nature of the Venezuelan state, whose extremely inefficient and corrupt forms of governments have become mixed with the destructive practices of authoritarian populism. In that regard, the Cuban experience has been quite different. It continues to be an isolated island of socialism, still employing a system that collapsed in Europe more than 30 years ago. Only a political transition to post-Castro reality, a COVID pandemic, and a global economic crisis will push Cuba to make changes. An inevitable rupture of the existing alliance between Cuba and Venezuela will actually accelerate the process. Ultimately, the transitional agendas of these two countries will likely follow different pathways. Thank you.
Muy bueno.
Thank you. That was very good. I appreciate it very much. Okay, so now we need to go to question and answers. And I will start with Carmelo, as soon as I get my notepad straight here. Well, the first question is from John McAuliffe, who tends to suggested many times.
I can hear you. I cannot understand you, Gary. I cannot hear you.
Okay, am I back on?
Yes.
Okay. John McAuliffe asked, if Cuba supported an internationally accepted political in Venezuela, and the U.S. exceeded international opinion by ending the embargo of Cuba, would that be a net loss or gain for the Cuban economy?
I couldn't understand. Can somebody that have a better audio repeat the question to me, please?
Okay. Suppose Cuba accepted an internationally politically acceptable political solution in Venezuela, and the U.S. ended the embargo of Cuba. Would that be a net loss or gain for the Cuban economy?
Okay. First, I am not a political scientist, but the possibility of an international kind of deal that will end the socialism in Cuba, I see almost improbable. I don't know what can happen in a year or so, but at this point, I don't think this is a feasible possibility. Now, if that is tied with the end of the U.S. embargo, but of course the first premise I think is false, then of course there will be an improvement in the Cuban economy. That improvement in the Cuban economy, because I show in my presentation that the cost of President Trump strengthening of the embargo. We are talking about billions of dollars, but the ending of the embargo doesn't mean that Cuba is going to have a flourishing economy. And that is based in a factor that I just mentioned, but I didn't discuss in this presentation, which is the continuation of an ineffective model of predominance of central planning and state enterprises over the market and private enterprise. I mean, these have failed all over the world, and including in Cuba for more than 60 years. So the ending of the embargo by itself, it could help Cuba, but it's not going to solve the structural problems of the Cuban economy, which is that I have been incapable in all these 62 years to pay imports with their own exports. I show you how exports are way below 1989 level. Imports are above, and therefore you have a significant trade deficit of goods. So that's my answer.
Okay. Next question from Lorenzo Perez. Can you define again the full grant component? You have that in your slides.
Yes, the full grant component, in other words, the full nominal amount that Venezuela subsidizes Cuba, is the difference between the export of services that are recorded from the official data minus the value of these exports of services at the salary that doctors get internationally. And in this case, I use the Brazilian salary, the salary that was paid to Cuban doctors in Brazil, which is known from the Brazilian government. So that difference essentially is the difference between the recorded price and the market price of the service. And that's the subsidy, the grant component. And that gives us the maximum possible amount that Venezuela is giving to Cuba, but not necessarily the effective amount, because effective amount will depend on the question, can Venezuela afford to give this subsidy in hard currency? And as we know, the numbers show that Venezuela has been weakening financially significantly in the last 4 years. We don't know the exact effective number, but it's right now it's well below the recorded number.
Could I ask a question?
Yeah.
Luis, I have measured this in another way, which is a Cuban doctor is paid Venezuela 7 times what an average Venezuelan doctor makes. Could you tell us, when you compare the price paid by Brazil with the price paid by Venezuela, what will be the relationship there? Oh.
Well, again, it varies, but if you use 40,000, which is the top number of Cuban personnel in Brazil, and use a Brazilian average salary, the number in 2017 comes up to about 150,000 or so dollars per person. But the Brazilian number for 2018 was about $38,000 per doctor. That's what the Brazilian doctor. We have the exact number actually, and yeah, it's a multiple. So Venezuela is a gold mine if you can get the money they're paying, because they are, number one, getting a lot more doctors than anybody else, and number two, they're paying a very large multiple, at least as recorded by the official numbers, so that it is a big multiple both ways.
So probably the proper way to calculate it would be to know the opportunity cost, either the domestic wage, as mentioned by Carmelo, or the international price as measured by what the Brazilians are paying. But the Brazilian case was also a political decision by the Brazilian government, and presumably has a lot of subsidy in it as well. So I don't know what the right number is, but it seems to me it's
well,
probably not as high as.
No, the Brazilian number is the average. It's the same salary paid to doctors in their health service.
Okay.
So that the Cubans get the same doctors as Brazilian doctors, and that supposedly is the market rate. I mean, it probably is below a little bit the market rate, but supposed to be the market rate.
Okay. For Carmelo, you talked about the monetary liquidity. I think that was you, not Louise. How did you measure that? The cups, deposits in cash, because you mentioned them too.
Nobody really knows, because Cuba, that, and also foreign trade figures are given, it says pesos. It doesn't specify whether it is a convertible peso or it is a national peso. So it's a CUC or CUP. It is assumed that is in CUC, but that not necessarily means the truth. The figure comes from the ONE statistical yearbook. And that means like a surplus dollars or surplus pesos in circulation. There is part in banks, but the majority of it is in circulation. And what I thought it was interesting is that the figure for 2018, which is the latest that we have available, because the figure for 2019 won't be available probably until November or October, that was the highest percentage of GDP since 1993. It was about the same of the percentage in 1992 and 1994. So that means that there is a similar situation that was happening during the crisis of the 1990s.
Okay. And the reform with talking about the selling, they will sell now in dollars in the so-called Coop stores and now dollar stores. Do you think that's likely to bring in any significant more foreign exchange, or is it just a redefining of the book?
Your voice is interrupted, Gary. Could you repeat it slowly, please?
Sure. What are now the dollar stores? It used to be the stores that sold in Cooks.
Right.
do you see this attracting any more dollars? Because when they sold in kooks, they had to bring in the dollars to convert them to kooks. Do you see anything in this that's going to bring in extra dollars?
Oh yeah, definitely. Well, let me clarify something. At this point in Cuba, you have dollar shops, actually hard currency, but it's mostly dollars. But before that, you have special shops that were selling in CUC.
Right.
Now you have the dollar shops, and you have also state shops that are selling in CUC and CUP. What is happening is that the CUC is practically vanishing. It's losing value, although of course the government continues with exchange rate. Theoretically, what you can buy at a state shop in dollars is different than what you can buy in pesos, be it CUC or CUP. But that is not clear, really. What we know, however, is that there is a phenomenal scarcity of consumer goods sold in Cuban currency, be it CUP or CUC. So the government is created this as a way to capture dollars. People that have dollars under the mattress, there is a desperate need for consumer goods because they are selling not only cars, motorcycles, spare parts, but they are selling important goods that are not available in the other shops in national currency. And therefore, people are going to these shops. By the way, the figure that I have seen, and I cannot confirm that, is that the profit, the markup in this dollar shop is 240%, which is higher than the figure that we had in the previous shops that were selling in CUC. It was about 120, 150. So they are making a lot of, they are getting dollars because they need them desperately due to the lack of liquidity in the economy. They cannot import, they cannot pay the structured debt with the Club of Paris. We don't know about other creditors elsewhere. So they need those dollars. And I think, yes, they are going to get more dollars, but this is only a short-term solution to the problem because we have a structural economic problem that definitely this is not going to solve. It was not solved when these shops were open in the 1990s. I mean, it may help, but it's not going to transform the Cuban economy.
Okay, thank you. And second here, sorry. For VAD, you mentioned that in some of the Asian countries after reform, those countries went through a transitional recession, and you seem to feel that's possible for Cuba as well. What caused the transitional recession in the Asian countries?
Yeah, thank you very much for this question. Because of deep institutional transformation. When you pass through this deep restructure, it's almost inevitable to face this transitional recession. In all countries, even with applied shock therapy, such as Poland, for example, or Hungary at the beginning of the 90s, they also pass through this transitional recession. But again, I'd like to stress that with current institutions, you can't move ahead. There is no other options. We see that they are exhausted. And that's why even if we name, I see another question addressed to me, let me answer. We know technically how to deal with this dramatic developments in Venezuela in economics. Stabilize macroeconomic situation, open space for private sector, negotiate debt restructuring, and so on and so forth. But you can't do it with current institutions. It's necessary also to start structural reforms. Otherwise, you fail again money and time trying to reform and initiate new growth in the country.
Okay. Another question. How do you account for the steady private sector growth under Chavez?
Yeah, that's a good question.
I should say I was in Venezuela at that time.
So first of all, as I said, we don't have reliable data because we can't see what's happening in informal sector. Yeah. First point. Second point, this data which I show are based on Central Bank of Venezuela information. And from my perspective, more important to see this declining trend of share of private sector in GDP. Yes, what was happening specifically at this short period of Chavez when, according to the Central Bank of Venezuela data, it was relatively small growth, but not percentage point, very non-significant. It's always was on the level of 64, 65%. But after that, it dropped in 20% or more. This trend is disastrous because it's withdraw private sector from the forces which can contribute to the economic growth.
I was reporting to Washington. I was in the embassy in Caracas, and I was reporting to the Washington at the time that actually the Chavez government's measures against the private sector up until about May of 2002, when they had that so-called double coup, actually were not that bad. The real problem was the rhetoric, which was awful and discouraged it. But I'm still surprised there was any increase in private investment.
Oh, sorry, just to come back. It was an inflow of oil money because the prices were very high. And we can see, if we return to the slides, that it was a peak of this money from nowhere. Maybe it stimulate some private sector activities, but it was, again, very short period.
Right. Okay, I got a question that's not clear to me what it's about. Ifan Velasquez, however, asks, the drop of Venezuela's oil production before 2017, by the way, if you don't know him, Ifan Velasquez is a Venezuelan economist who participated in ASCE last year and hopefully will do so again. But the drop in oil production was caused by massive corruption, PDVSA's operational problems, and PDVSA's social projects financing. Starting in 2017, U.S. sanctions have had a major impact. The new 2020 U.S. sanctions are affecting Venezuela oil production even more because of a lack of Venezuela's oil buyers and limited storage capacity. In this context, Cuba will be deeply affected, based on Professor Luis's analysis.
Yeah, it's true. It's common, my understanding. But maybe it's necessary to look more carefully at the specific time. But yes, there is now a pressure of global recession. Yeah, and even we can see how price war between Russia and Saudi impact on Venezuela. But it's another story. Again, in general, it's comments, and I agree.
Okay, well, that's the summary of the questions received so far. Wait a minute, there's a new one just came in.
Oh, no, you'll have some more.
Oh, yes, here we go. Do you think that Cuba is seeking another barter partner to replace Venezuela? If so, is this China or some other country? Larry, you might try to answer that, but I'll take answers from anybody.
Okay, I mentioned that very briefly in my presentation. My opinion was that neither Russia nor China can replace Venezuela entirely. Both countries can provide help, aid, but not replace Venezuela. And the first reason is that the first source of hard currency, even today, despite the decline of buying from Venezuela, is an export of professional services. And of course, none of these countries have ever bought professional services from Cuba. The Soviet Union used to buy manual labor from Cuba way back, but have never hired professional. Physicians would have to learn the language. Imagine learning Chinese or Russian. I mean, this is not an easy task. Therefore, this is a major reason. The second major reason is that when you look at the trade of goods, because first was services, right? But when you look at trade of goods between the two countries, China is second. Venezuela is first and China is second. But the trend over the last 5 or 6 years doesn't show any significant increase in trade between China and Venezuela. Actually, the figure for the last year that we have is 2018 is lower than 3 or 4 years ago. China also have given some aid to Cuba, but nothing that can compare with the aid that China has given countries like Argentina, for instance, or buying in this country. So the Chinese investment in Cuba is a small fraction that what other countries in Latin America have received from China. And then Russia, we are talking, I think it's about 6 trade partners. So that means that the percentage of trade of Russia with Cuba is something in the magnitude of 4% of total Cuban trade. So all these figures indicate very strongly. And of course, we have now a world crisis that is affecting China for the first time. They have this fabulous growth rate of 10% or more. Now this year, there will be either a substantial decline in that figure, or there will be maybe a negative, a relatively small negative. So the situation of these countries make it extremely difficult that they could replace Venezuela.
Yeah, I should add that China has shown tough love to Cuba. And in 2018, one knows that Chinese credits to Cuba were cut. And that's why Chinese exports, among other things, were going down. And I think that what Cuba needs is, it's hard to say, but having a big daddy is probably not a good thing.
One observation on the Cuban oil situation. Cuba, of course, is facing all the difficulties mentioned by all the participants. It's not just the drop in Venezuelan oil, it's the drop in other exports, drop in remittances, the drop in tourism, and so on. But one bright light in all this is, of course, oil prices have gone down rather significantly.
What is that again?
Oil prices have gone down rather
Yes.
significantly. And so to some extent, Cuba gets a benefit from that. To the extent that it's got to import more oil on its own account, it's got somewhat cheaper prices to pay than before. Okay, and let's see. Questions again? Okay.
Oh,
One
Can
of
I
our-
can I answer
Go
that?
ahead. Sure.
Recall that Cuba was making a big profit from crude oil that was sent by Venezuela, and it was refined in the Cienfuegos refinery, and then Cuba sent back part of that oil to Venezuela, but also the remaining oil was exported in the world market at the price at the time. So on the one hand, a lower oil price means that theoretically, based on the agreement between the two countries, Cuba will have to export less professional services because the cost of oil will be less. On the other hand, Cuba, the Venezuelan export of crude for Cienfuegos, at least by half have declined, even more perhaps. And therefore, Cuba doesn't have that surplus oil to export to other countries and make that profit.
Okay. And we're running out of time, but I'm going to give the last question to Vad. You talked about, this is from Natalie Delgado, one of our new board members. She asked, what are the essential reforms you feel Venezuela needs to make now?
Reforms.
Yes.
Yeah. So structural reforms. First of all, in the well-known categories, rule of law, including property rights, freedom from corruption. So you need to restructure government management. Opportunities for private investors, including foreign direct investments, and a lot of things connected with the redistribution of wealth and financial flows. It's necessary to regulate expenditures. Deep fiscal reform is also necessary to implement. Plus, measures to stabilize macroeconomic situation. It's maybe not structural, but again, you can't achieve any results without this institutional and structural reforms.
Well, thank you very much. And let me thank the entire panel. I think you all did a very good job. I'm sorry for some of the internet problems we had at the beginning. I think it was at my end. But I think everybody learned a lot. I've been following Cuba for 22, 23 years, and I learned some more stuff today, so I appreciate that. So we will see everybody tomorrow morning and for another good session. And I thank everyone.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Tomorrow. Thank you.
Tomorrow.
Thank you.
Thank you.